Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have Mark Colgan on the show. Mark is an entrepreneur and revenue leader responsible for a portfolio of companies where he leverages his 13 years experience of B2B sales, marketing, and recruitment. Mark currently splits his time as co-founder of Speak on Podcasts, mentoring B2B startups via Growth Mentor and ScaleWise, the product onboarders, and coaching hundreds of SDRs through his outbound prospecting course via the Sales Impact Academy. He's a Techstars 18 alumni and a regular speaker within the B2B SaaS industry. Today, Mark and I are going to talk about the importance of being featured on podcasts, how to get featured, and why it's important to diversify from running your own podcasts and being on others. Enjoy the show. So there's this idea that podcasts will get you thousands of views and make you a household name. I see it regularly where, someone who maybe is a LinkedIn personality or has more notoriety, that'll directly translate into a podcast. And I don't know that that's necessarily the purpose of a B2B podcast. I see it as a little bit more of a niche play to get you in front of the right people in your space. And you and I happen to both play in the same space of B2B and lots of times B2B tech. Mm-hmm. What do you think is most important for B2B tech companies to either have a podcast or to be featured on podcasts?
Yeah, so I think both are equally important. At the end of the day, when you're on your own podcast, it's you that's putting yourself in that position of authority and credibility. So that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing necessarily. But then if you speak on other people's podcasts, then you also have the third-party validation. It's almost like having social proof on your website, but rather than it being what you're writing on your website, which we all know you can make up and put on your own website, it's like having Trustpilot or G2 Crowd reviews. It's third-party endorsements for you as a business.
And you and I have talked a lot about giving away value since the first time that I talked to you, maybe a year ago. And I think that mentality stems from podcasting and having a love for this medium. Why do you believe in giving away information for free?
I think the consumer is just more smarter and has access to information than they ever have had before. I think a lot of people draw the analogies of buying a car. Back in the day, you used to go to a car forecourt and the person would try and sell you the car that they made the most commission on. Whereas now you can go online, look at Auto Trader in the UK, there's lots of other marketplaces for cars, and make an informed decision based by yourself. And I think that translates into today's buyer's journey with people who are evaluating software or technology. They're doing a lot of this research themselves. And if you're a company that's not giving away your value freely and not helping your potential prospects, then they're just going to have more of an affinity of working with the companies that do.
And how do you prove success from that? So when you're giving away things for free, especially information, and then when it comes to a podcast, it's very ungated content. You a lot of times have no idea who the actual people are they're listening, but you kind of have to trust the process, if you will. Mm-hmm. So how do you prove success from people going on podcasts?
Yeah, and it's a tough one. It's a tough question to ask. And the first thing I say to people is that it's not the same as a paid ads campaign. It's not the same as going to a trade show and collecting and scanning people's business cards. It's just not that tangible. There are ways that you can kind of look at attributing the success. So you could be asking people as they fill out a contact form, where did they hear from you? That will be, they'll often say the podcast. You'll get inbound as well. And, the amount of salespeople that never ask the inbounds where they heard them from, they just look at the lead source in the CRM, but the lead source might say LinkedIn. but what part of LinkedIn? Was it the LinkedIn company page? Was it an individual profile? Was it because they saw or heard somebody on a podcast before? So there's ways to evaluate the success of it, and then also in terms of organic traffic increasing and more people saying, "Yeah, I've heard of you guys," or I know what you do because I heard you on this show or I read the content. Because podcasting is just one medium. We've also got kind of ebooks and resources and other sort of written content too.
And so we've talked about, kind of giving away value, and why that's important. What is your approach for getting your clients or even yourself on podcasts?
So our approach always starts with research and just making sure that we're reaching out to the most relevant podcasts based on the audience that I or our customers want to speak to, as well as what's going to be valuable to the audience. At the end of the day, the bet that we make is that a podcast host is interested in providing value to their audience. Like, that's what we hope. And in most
Mhm.
cases, that is true. So what we're looking to do is play matchmaker between the topics and the audience criteria of our customers and the podcast host and the audience that they serve with their podcast. And then all we do is make introductions. We've eradicated the word pitching because no one likes to be pitched to. So we make introductions, and that's our job. We broker these introductions between these really great podcast hosts and the awesome customers that we have. And it just comes down to relevancy.
And how do you decide? Yeah, so it sounds like relevancy is a big thing there. How do you decide which shows that your clients should go on?
Yeah, so we've got an internal process that we use. We call it a research matrix. So it's the starting point of all the research. The first thing we do is look at the audience. So we ask every customer, if you were to be on stage talking in front of 1,000 people, who are those 1,000 people? What do they look like? So we're really just trying to understand their ideal customer profiles and buyer personas. And then there's just a lot of thinking and context. It's like, where do these people listen? Who do they listen to? We may also look at competitors and also industry influencers. The great thing about B2B tech is that there's always a few competing platforms with the technology. So if we're working for one company, we might go and see which podcast their competitors have been on, and then we want to double check that to make sure it's the right audience for our customer based on their preferences. We also use like keywords as well as categorization of the actual podcast too. So it is a real combination. And we were just having this conversation internally. There's a lot of context that goes into the research. It's not a simple that says marketing, so that's the right podcast for somebody who's interested in talking about marketing.
Yeah, because that would be, kind of my next question is, I've had people reach out to me to say that they want to come on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say much more often than not, I don't see them as a fit for my podcast. So that when it comes to, these, this kind of engagement of you serving as the booking agency is like, how do you ensure that the client that you're representing, how do you ensure that when they go and record a podcast that the content is going to be good?
Yeah, so we work a lot with our customers to make sure that they know the topics they want to talk about. And oftentimes the feedback we get from them is that this has been a really helpful exercise because they haven't been asked these questions in this way. So we often ask, what's their area of expertise? What controversial opinions do they have? When I say controversial, it's more ethically controversial, where they go against the grain of what normally is said in the market. And then we actually work with them and practice interviews with them too. So we know that their delivery is great as well. But one of the biggest things that we do is we suggest that the podcast host has a 15-minute, maybe a pre-interview conversation. So they can not only start to build rapport with our customer and vice versa, but they can also talk about some of the topics. Now, we share some suggested topics, but they're only suggestions. Of course, we can't cover everything that our customers can talk about in just 4 or 5 bullet points. So we go through, we create the topics, and then we share that with the podcast host. And we say, of course, if there are other things you'd like to talk about with said customer, you're more than welcome to have that conversation with them, and we encourage that pre-interview chat.
And what are you finding to be the biggest reason that people are reaching out to you to begin to be featured on podcasts?
The companies that we really enjoy working with, and we've seen a lot more of them come through recently, are those that understand that speaking on podcasts is a brand awareness campaign. It's like PR. But I don't know the last time I've never seen a press release, read it, and then gone and bought the technology. It's just the old way of PR just simply doesn't work anymore. So we're working with companies who also understand that. They want to build their brand awareness. They want to be seen everywhere because, as you know, the content that you can repurpose from a 30-minute interview is pretty much endless. So that's another reason that they come to work with us as well, is to have the ability to create these cornerstone pieces of content. So it's increasing that brand awareness, recognition, become a trusted advisor in their space. And so that when they're outbound sales reps, if they have that go-to-market strategy, talking to people are familiar with the brand, and they've heard the founder or the CMO or whoever their C-suites that are getting on the podcast, they've heard them speak before.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, value is obviously important, and we talked about that, but you have to have a way to put that value in front of people, I think more so than just being on the podcast itself. So what are you doing to help your clients in terms of actual repurposed content creation?
Yeah, so we do have the option for our customers, if they choose to use it, where we can repurpose the content for them. So very similar to what you guys do. We're not as good as video as you guys. You're the experts, but we do take the videos if they have been video recorded for the interview, and we repurpose that into the content. But it really starts with listening to the content and the interview and taking out the nuggets that are the best bits from each interview, and then we turn that into several pieces of content for them as well. But that's just one of the benefits. One of the other ways that there's value is exchange from speaking on podcasts is building that relationship with the podcast host themselves. Those hosts are often speaking to your ideal customers time and time again, and there's endless possibilities to create joint venture partnerships or affiliate deals with the podcast host as well, which I don't think enough people take advantage of.
No, it is very striking that you only really experience the relationship building of what podcasting provides to you as the host or as the guest, other than by doing it. I mean, the amount of people who I have amazing relationships with, and not necessarily, to try to sell them my service. A lot of these folks, someone like yourself, who we met through podcasting and talking about podcasting, that I just now have all these connections all over the place with people who either are in my space. We had Squadcast, which is the tool that I'm using right now to record. We had them on our podcast. Now we're doing video content for them in a sort of, pseudo partnership, people like yourself. Then I have podcasters who play in my space, and maybe they're CMOs at companies that one day I'd want to work with. You really don't start to get the feel for all of the energy that comes behind the podcast with that relationship building side unless you're doing it. It's very hard to tell someone about it unless they get their feel for it themselves. How do you go about talking to people about that, relationship building side of podcasting?
Sure. Yeah. I think you've just got to remember that it's a long game. Like most things in life, it is the long game that you're playing, and the relationships don't happen overnight. You have to nurture them. So we actually have we have an academy which our customers can go through should they choose to, which we talk about how to nurture the relationships with the podcast host. Starts with the pre-interview chat, starts with the interview, before the interview starts, after the interview starts, even simple templates, just saying, thanks for having me on the podcast. Those little touch points go a long way. So we give our customers everything that we would appreciate and that has worked for us in the past as well. And then we encourage them to stay in touch with them on a regular basis. For example, when the episode goes live, because depending when it's recorded, it might be a little while until that episode goes live. It's sharing the fact that it's live and thanking the host on LinkedIn and tagging them in the comments, encouraging our customers to share the interviews in their newsletter, in their product updates, anywhere that they can, to just deposit some goodwill in the Karma Bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you just look at, this situation, right? So like I have Mark on the podcast right now. I sent a note over to have to see if you'd be interested in coming on. There's one touch point. And then you and I jump on pre-call to talk about what we're going to talk about on today's show. There's 2. Then I have you on here. There's 3. I'm going to send you the repurposed materials after this is done. There's 4. Then I'm going to tag you on LinkedIn and Twitter in the different assets, probably another 7 to 12 times. And, I'm not trying to ever really sell Mark anything, but at the same time, that is a lot of engagement with one individual without having to do much else other than what I'm already doing to do my show. I think, when you build it, and that's what we've done, and it sounds like what you've done in a very systematic approach, that you almost have no choice but to build a relationship with this person, because they just keep hearing from you for, what is probably going to be like 60 to 90 days.
Sure. And now you're staying top of mind. All of these little interactions that you're having with me, you're not necessarily like changing my life every time we speak, but I'm just like, oh, Justin again. He's tagged me. That's great. You tagged me in a comment just before I was on a call. I saw it come through on LinkedIn, so I didn't get a chance to engage with it, but you tagged me before the interview. So who am I going to think about when I have a company that comes to me and says, hey, Mark, do you know anyone that can work with B2B, can help B2B companies produce a podcast? It's not something that we do or we're interested in doing. I'm going to think of Justin, because he's had that constant touch points with me over the last 30 days and in the next 90 days.
Exactly. And I'm curious when it comes to, I obviously have my approaches when it comes to distributing materials from the podcast. What do you see the best companies doing? And let me preface this with, this could be either on your client side or on the side of podcasts that you are having people featured on. What do you see the best companies doing when distributing materials from the podcasts?
Yeah, I think the best that I see is people that repurpose the content into smaller, digestible pieces of content, offer that freely on their LinkedIn, on their organic. They also add additional context to it, give some more value, and rather than just saying, watch this video, there's an accompanying text post that goes with that as well. And again, one of our customers turned around to me and said, Mark, I just want to be effing everywhere. So can you double down on the amount of podcasts you book for us? And we're like, sure, of course we can. But that's the attitude that he has for his business. He doesn't want a prospect to not have heard his voice or not have seen his branding, not have seen his company. So taking that 30-minute interview and repurposing it into 20 pieces of content in a micro format and just having it constantly everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think sometimes we talk to folks as well, and they say the opposite of I want to be effing everywhere. And they say, I'm worried that maybe people will think we're posting too much or that we're talking about our podcast too much. And I just have the completely opposite view. I mean, if you look at the people who are performing the best on just LinkedIn and then Twitter, you take it to the next level, because on LinkedIn, some of the best people are probably posting once per day for a long extended period of time. And then on Twitter, posting 5, 10, 20 times per day on Twitter. And to stand out there, I mean, you need to be publishing content that people care about, and it needs to look good, sound good, etc. You need to bring, credibility behind what you're saying. And I think there are the two sides of that coin. Of course, I create my own podcast here, but then being featured, and this was, you'll see when you see what I tagged you in, Mark. But I talk about it does bring a next level of thought leadership, I think, to you as an individual, even if you run a podcast, to then be featured. It's like, anybody can hit the record button and create a podcast. I'm not saying it's easy, but anybody can and say, hey, I'm a thought leader. But when you start to get featured on other podcasts, I think it lends credibility to, some other people wanted to hear what I had to say.
For sure. And there's a reason why people want to get landed in Forbes and Fast Company and have those kind of big icon logos on their website. But to the people on the other side of the coin, where they're a bit concerned about speaking too much or sharing too much, the reality is that only the person who's saying that is going to see all of that content. Like, the majority of your audience isn't going to see every piece of your content anyway. So if you think that you're posting too much, you're not. Is the answer?
Yeah, I have yet to find someone who posts too much, because there's just a reality that we all deal with, which is that time is limited. And usually you don't have someone, at least with the clients, especially that we work with, our traditional audience is marketing teams of 1 to 5, right?
Yeah.
When you have a small but mighty marketing team like that, lots of times you don't have someone whose only job is social media. Social media is usually something that's bolted on to someone's job description, and they don't have the time to sit there and all day interact like maybe some bigger brands do. So
Yeah.
completely agree.
And Justin, here's what I think is the most genius part about speaking on podcasts. It's that you typically talk about overcoming a challenge or how people are overcoming challenges. You point out the solution to a challenge that your ideal customers have. That's ideal if you're speaking on podcasts about those topics. People are going to find that interview when they have that problem. So when someone's trying to work out how do I close more deals, how do I work my outbound prospecting, how do I get better reply rates on my cold emails, for example, they're going to be searching this information. And this goes back to the point of like giving value and freely giving it. You have that on a podcast. I got contacted from over the weekend from a podcast interview I did in 2019. The person only listened to it now, and they've booked a call with me because they need help with what I was talking about in 2019. So it's an evergreen piece of content that once it's there, it lives in the ecosystem of your buyer's journey where they're looking for the solution, and you happen to have positioned yourself as the expert that can solve that. That's not talked about enough, I don't think, in the benefits of podcasting.
Well, let's go through this exercise ourselves then, so that when someone looks up, how do I get myself booked on podcasts? What do I do? What is, without giving away necessarily proprietary templates or whatever it may be, but what is the approach that you take to get people booked onto podcasts?
Sure. So we have a team of booking agents that do all of the research as well as the listening to the podcasts that are relevant. So we listen to several episodes. We're looking for the key context that we can connect our customers to the podcast previous guests that they've had or topics that they've spoken about. Sometimes that might be a solo episode that they did. Other times it might be that a guest has been on there. So we reference the fact that we heard a very similar topic to what we're going to suggest with our customer. And then we bridge that into why we think our customer might make a good fit, because they can talk about something similar or something completely opposite, that opposing opinion to what was previously spoken about. And then we end it with a softer call to action, which is, would you be interested? It's not like, let's schedule the time, because that's way too presumptive. And our emails, we constantly get feedback day in, day out from podcast hosts saying, you really know how to do this. You really know how to build relationships. You really know how to represent your customers in the right way. And we know that we are pitching. We know that we are interrupting the podcast hosts every day when we send the emails. So we work our hardest to make sure that it's actually a valuable introduction, and it's going to be a relevant guest for their podcast. Now, of course, Justin, as you and I know, some podcasts only interview people who are their exact ideal customer, because they are using this kind of network-based podcasting as a strategy. So there are going to be times where podcast hosts say, no, it's not right for me. But because we haven't shot ourselves in the foot and just spammed them, the person's relevant. It's just that it doesn't fit their exact criteria. Then they leave having a positive experience anyway. And that just helps us in the future as well.
And regardless, I would argue that that's probably not the best approach for a podcast anyway, to only do, account-based podcasting or whatever term you want to use for it, which is to use it as a sales tool. I think that if done the right way, and your approach, as well as the approach that I would take, would be always to have value for the audience. And if you're recommending an interviewee as someone who could provide potential value to the audience that this podcast caters to, even if they're not someone that podcast host would want to sell to per se, that it should be a fit, or worst case, kind of not right now. And you see that on the podcast ownership side, which is that done the right way with the right types of email templates or questions or calls to action, that a lot of time, the vast majority of my clients, they don't get crushed the way that SDRs do. You see it on Twitter and LinkedIn. People love to call out SDRs. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the best approach myself for content, but people do it. But at the same time, when it comes to booking podcasts on the podcast side, it's like, people have a warm reception to being asked to join a podcast. Like, wow, I stood out to you. Maybe it's not a fit right now, but at least I would still want to thank you for coming on. And then on your side, for me, I have to book my own podcast guests. So if someone like yourself were to reach out to me with something that was at least close, it would be a welcome thing to come my way, even though I may not know this person. I may turn it down still, but at the same time, I appreciate people trying to save me time. So
Sure. Yeah, we do. We generally see that there is a warm reception to emails. Now, sometimes we catch people on a bad day, but we're very adult about it when we get responses like that. But they don't happen that often at all. But yeah, you made a really good point, which I probably didn't highlight too much. But it is all about the value that this person can give to that audience of the podcast host. And we get responses sometimes where people say, "Hey, we don't work with podcast booking agencies," and then our response is like, "All right, cool, completely respect that. Do you mind if we ask our customer to send you an email directly?" And they're like, "Sure, that's fine." It's bonkers because they're still getting the same person at the end of the day. But we don't want to stand in the way of our customers getting on a podcast that's a great fit for them. And we know that they can provide some value as well. So, we help our customers just kind of circumnavigate that objection that we get.
And I think that that's probably just because people have had bad experiences.
Unfortunately,
I've been asked to have people on my podcast who just are not even close to a fit. And so unfortunately, there's a negative stigma a lot of times with most things that are related to cold outreach, whether you want to call it pitching or not. It's a tough business, and you got to have, I think, some thick skin to be able to move by it, which sounds like you do, which is impressive. I think you get enough no's over time that it starts to hurt a little bit less.
I started out as a BDR. It was boiler room, pick up the phone, money comes out. So my skin is as thick as they come. And, I do have to remind our booking agents, like, don't take it personally. Like, they're just having a bad day. It's not you, it's them. So we do provide a little bit of support and counseling in those situations. But overall, I do find that the podcast hosts are generally quite receptive to the idea of being introduced to a guest. And it makes a whole world of difference when that guest is relevant to them.
Yeah, for sure. And I also spent my early days as an SDR. We actually called them account executives back in the day. They weren't even. There was no such thing as an SDR yet. It hadn't been a role. What's that?
The predictable revenue book hadn't come out yet. That's why.
Exactly. Aaron Ross comes out with his book, and the whole world rebranded. Yeah. I know that all too well myself, and yeah, it starts to sting a little bit less once you've done it quite a few times.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple more questions for you. If you were going to give someone, if somebody wanted to start to get featured on podcasts, and you were going to give them one piece of advice about getting onto podcasts, what would it be?
Yeah, so start with the right research first of all. Well, first of all, understand why it is that you want to get on there and who do you want to speak to, and then just reach out via LinkedIn or via email to the podcast host. Make sure that you're demonstrating the value that you can offer their audience, and reach out and start that conversation. And just remember, the whole point of outbound, whether it be sales or for pitching, whatever, is to start the conversation, not to get the yes. So that's where I'd go. And then one more bit of tip as well, Justin. I've actually put together, the first thing I did when I started speaking on podcasts is I put together a guide of how you could do this yourself if you didn't want to work with us, going back to giving value without expecting anything in return, right? So one of the things that we say is go and have a look at who your competitors are, which podcasts your competitors are speaking on, and just reach out to them. You know that they may have been pre-qualified by your competitor, and I think it's always a great thing to go on the same podcast that your competitor's been on too.
Awesome. Those are great pieces of advice, and definitely go check out some of the materials that Mark has on his website. And then here's a high risk question for you that I have, just because I'm going to have you basically sell against what I do. Is it more, if somebody had to choose one or the other, do you think it's more important for someone to start off with their own show or to start off by appearing as a guest on a show?
Yeah, so I would say it's a big commitment to put your stake in the ground and set up your own podcast if you've never spoken on podcasts before. So I would always encourage, go and speak on podcasts, whether you work with a company like mine or you go directly yourself. Test the water out, because the last thing you want to do is do 4 or 5 episodes of your own podcast and go, I hate this. Once you've determined that you like podcasts and it is a good thing for you to do, then you are building your own branded asset if you build your own podcast. So then I think it's a great strategy. In the ideal world, you want to do both.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's where, I kind of live, is I try to be featured on podcasts, as well as running my own. And you do fall in love with the medium. And I think one of the best places to start, and again, Mark, you'll see this in my post from today, is just, getting out there and getting in front of different audiences and finding out what you like and what you don't like, and being featured as a guest. It is fun because even though, sometimes I find myself talking quite a bit on my show, the more important person to talk to is the guest, or in this situation, you. When you get to go get featured on a podcast, you have the opportunity to start to tell your story a little bit, and you become the storyteller, and that host of that show is more of the guide for that show. And so there is a lot of fun to running your own show, and there's a lot of fun as well in being featured.
Yeah, and like I said, in the ideal world, you'd want to do both, because when you go and speak on other people's podcasts, they may have already been established for a few years. They've built up a bigger audience than what you're starting out with as well. So you may see more traction straight away by speaking on a very large or larger podcast than just your own. But then if you build your own podcast, you're building and investing in an asset that you own and control, which, again, going back to playing the long game, is a very smart thing to do.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a pretty good spot to end, Mark. Before I let you go, where can people go to learn more about you and more about Speak on Podcasts?
Sure. So the best place to learn a little bit more about me is LinkedIn. So Mark Colgan, there's not too many on there. And if you'd like to find out more about Speak on Podcasts, you can visit speakonpodcasts.com. We try to keep the name simple.
All right. Well, Mark, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with me, and it was great having you on Recorded Content.
Cheers, Justin. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.